formidable robot.
The following post was written by a user on a rather short-lived site called Tip of the Tongue Media. On this site, people can discuss strange and relatively obscure media that they remember from their childhood but could not remember the titles of if their lives depended on it. The user was known as Xanadu96, real name Javier Mendez, who seems to have his own strange story to tell. Hello, I'm new here, and I was told by some friends of mine that this site deals with obscure media that seems to be childhood lost media of a sort. Well, I have my own childhood lost media to talk about today. But first, I suppose I should give a little bit of background. Growing up, I've always had a soft spot for the edutainment genre of games. Notably, the ones from the 90s and early 2000s. I've played quite a number of them growing up, ranging from the Magic School Bus to Carmen Sandiego, and practically just about everything in between. Sure, some of them might seem janky and maybe even unintentionally horrifying by today's standards, looking at you Sonic's Schoolhouse, but there's a certain charm to them that I don't think can ever be matched. Or maybe that's just my old age of 26 speaking. Anyway, there are a few things I want to talk about that I remember playing as a kid, when I was about 6 or so, on an old Windows 98 computer in my grandparents' study. But well, I cannot for the life of me remember what they were called. Let's start with the more tame things and/or things that I remember very few details about, and get into the strangest one in my opinion towards the end. Sounds like a nice way to order things, right? I'll try to be as detailed as I can, but keep in mind that I'm merely going off a memory that's at least 20 years old at this point, so details might be a little bit fuzzy to non-existent. I want to apologize in advance for that, but it never did occur to me at the time to write these experiences down in a journal or something while the details were still fresh in my mind. So anyway, here goes. An educational program about whales that may or may not have been made by Sierra. The reason I say this is because I vaguely remember a title card for Sierra being pulled on screen by a little brown alien-looking creature that honestly reminded me of the little green men characters from Toy Story. Once the alien succeeds in pulling the logo onto the screen, he says in an incredibly high-pitched voice,
"Phew! Sierra!"
A menu for what appeared to be a demo disc with ambient spacey sound effects, which depicts a white star in the center of the screen. 3 pastel-colored spheres with the titles of the games that the demo disc contained that would gyrate wildly on them would proceed to pop out from the star with a ping sound effect before they would orbit the star like they were planets. Sweet Jeebus, that was a big-ass commaless sentence. You might be thinking to yourself that these planets had the game's titles on them, so I should remember them. But that's the thing, I never did. Maybe I was too focused on the admittedly desolate-sounding ambience in the background to really notice them in detail, who knows. A demo, I think, for a game despite the fact that I did not remember any gameplay happening in this one at all, for some weird reason. It just showed this mad scientist, a man who looked kind of like Albert Einstein, who would show the player around his lab. The only things I really remember that were included in this tour were an introduction to many games involving the alphabet, if I recall, and the solar system, 2 of my absolute favorite topics at the time. Really makes me regret not bugging my grandparents to get me the full game so I could play it for real. A demo for a game involving cartoonish sickeningly colorful monsters. Which involved the monsters involved in various hijinks, again sorry for not being more descriptive than that, which caused the state of California to explode before it crumbled to pieces. The view would then cut to black for a split second and then show a zoomed-in version of the crumbled remains of California. I remember that's how it ended. Rather bleak way to end things, wouldn't you say? I do have a theory of what the full game could have been about. Perhaps it was trying to be a game somewhere in the same vein as Carmen Sandiego, but it has it to where you, the player, go on a quest to find a MacGuffin that will put California back together again, possibly learning facts about the state along the way. Maybe California is a tutorial stage of a sort, introducing the player to the game's mechanics. In the meantime, The villain or villains have already done the same thing to the other states in America, where they've crumbled to pieces as well, and you will need to repeat all the steps you learned in California to save America. Then again, that's just my theory. Okay, I think it's time to talk about what's possibly the strangest thing I've ever experienced. Here goes nothing. I suppose I should start the description of this by saying that calling this thing a game would be a huge misnomer. The best way I can describe this thing is that it seems to be something of a visual encyclopedia, where you would presumably click on items in the scene and learn information about them. But the way it's presented is strange to say the least. First off, there was no music or really much sound design at all, except maybe the faint sound of blowing wind, making everything awkwardly quiet. Secondly, the scene that's presented on the screen looked very steampunkish, as it consisted of mostly beige, brown and black. It wasn't exactly the most colorful environment I'd seen, with maybe one exception. A red ant that would choppily, by which I mean that its animation was missing a few dozen frames, skitter back and forth in the bottom right corner of the screen. I don't know what drove me to click on it. Maybe it was because it was the only colorful thing in the scene. Or maybe the only thing in the scene that was actively moving. Clicking on the ant would bring up a small window within the game, which showed a black and white presentation where an ant was on display with the word ant written in black letters at the bottom. This presentation had a narrator, who sounded rather monotone, or maybe drunk, like he just wasn't really that invested or interested in what he was talking about. Maybe he was being held against his will. He would start the presentation by talking about how the ant is divided up into 3 parts, the head, the thorax, and the abdomen. A small black arrow would point to each part as he said them. The arrow would then trace itself over the top half of the ant's body before disappearing altogether as the narrator mumbled something I couldn't really make out. What he said probably could have provided context for what happened next. Next thing I knew, a rather comically large knife, in just 2 fell strokes, literally chopped off one side of the ant's head as well as its entire abdomen. As this was happening, a laugh track played in the background, as if I was supposed to find this random act of cruelty hilarious. I didn't laugh, however. I just remember sitting there, wide-eyed in what might have been shock. Sure, this act wasn't particularly bloody or gory, but it was still shocking nonetheless. I wasn't exactly scared either. I suppose it's like that old saying goes, it's like watching a train wreck, no matter how horrible it might be, you just can't look away. The narrator would then continue his presentation as if nothing happened, where he would say that ants have 6 legs, like all insects. Riveting and shocking information, I know. As another black arrow pointed to each leg in turn, I could have sworn I heard the narrator say, "They're all here," or "Here all here," the latter of which he would drunkenly emphasize the first "here," before he mumbled something else I couldn't understand. Again, probably would have been helpful to know for context's sake. Regardless, what happened next was a human hand would come on screen, which proceeded to pluck the ant's legs off one by one. The laugh track returned while this was happening, although, and this might have been my imagination, but I could have sworn I heard the laughter devolve more into boos and heckles as the ant's last 2 legs were being pulled off. This boo-heckle track continued for a few seconds as the ant in the presentation now looked more like a small black submarine after being torn apart, then trailed off as the ant in real life proceeded to choppily flip over onto its back, as if it was playing dead. I had no idea what I just witnessed, but out of curiosity, I clicked on the ant again. Clicking on the ant a second time would just cause the same boo-heckle track and the ant's play dead animation again, and nothing more than that. Then it would appear that it would just loop from here. I had so many questions. Namely questions like, what was this? What kind of sicko would include things like this in what was supposed to be children's entertainment? Was it even made for children? Sure, the presentation I just talked about didn't contain any blood or gore, but it was still unnerving in what it showed, almost like it was trying to be as shocking as possible. If I recall correctly, this was a demo as well, but if that's the case, who in their right mind would want to see the full thing? Unless you have a weird fascination with the macabre. Because if the ant presentation is any indication, the full encyclopedia would most likely contain just more of the same, with other animals being on display and being torn apart. And for what? Science? Education? Or maybe for the creator's own sick pleasure. Your guess is as good as mine, honestly. I suppose I'm just making this post because, well, I kind of want closure. That everything I just talked about was real and not some weird fever dream that I had. That other people experienced the same things that I did but have a lot more clear memories of everything that happened, including what they could have been made for. So please, can anyone help me out here? I'd greatly appreciate it.